The night fort was a place where the wind learned a voice and used it to tell lies. Jon Snow had always believed that, even before Sam had spoken of the Black Gate beneath, before ravens had come with their curious tidings, before the tales of the long night were once again the talk of cookfires and cold crowded halls. Standing under a roof that sagged like old shoulders and a sky that wavered with pale ribbons, Jon listened to the wind speak through broken stone and felt ghost bristle soundlessly against his leg. It was not fear that moved the wolf. It was recognition. There was a smell in the night fort tonight, damp earth, old stone, a faint sweetness of rot, like the breath of a root cellar that had held more than turnips. Jon tried not to breathe too deeply as the torch in his left hand shed a wavering pool of light, painting the tunnel walls with amber and shadow. The torch hissed where molten drips found a puddle, and the sound slithered down the corridor ahead of him, thinner and thinner until it faded into a hush. The hush answered in a whisper, not of wind this time, but of something like a sigh caught in wood. "Do you hear it?" he asked quietly. Ghost's ears pricked. The white wolf pushed his narrow head forward, nostrils flaring. He made no sound. He never needed to. Jon shifted his grip on Longclaw. The Valyrian steel caught the torchlight and drank it, reflecting back a dull, smokeless glow where a common blade would have flashed bright. He had come alone save for Ghost. Dolorous Ed had offered, and so had Torment, laughing that he liked the taste of old places because they had no teeth left. But Jon had refused them both. There were some doors a man had to open without witnesses, so that if he was a fool, only his own ghost would reproach him. Sam's letter had said the words plain as any, and Bran's face in the weirwood had blinked them like a message from some deeper vein of the world. Beneath the night fort there is a gate that knows blood from blue from bone. Go and listen. There is a place where the first men learned to bind fire to iron and iron to night. The way is not remembered by books but by roots. Roots. Ghost's hackles smoothed as the corridor widened into a cavern, whose ceiling vanished into darkness like a well that opened upwards into the night instead of down. Their torch showed what it could. A pool in the center, black as polished coal. The smooth swell of a mound that on approach proved to be a stone with a face carved shallow into it. The features long worn but unmistakable. 2 eyes closed. A mouth. The Black Gate. Jon's heart beat harder. He felt the wall far above them like an old pressure over a wound. The night fort had been deserted for generations before he was born. No one slept here now, and yet the place hummed with something that felt like breath. His breath turned white and then vanished. "Open," Jon said, because Sam had said you must. The word scraped from his throat and fell on the stone like a coin you toss and don't hear land. He thought of Sam's ink-blotted script, the way the letters stumbled and collected themselves. The old tales were a skein Sam had written, and like any skein you could follow one thread through a knot if only you found which end to pull. Pull at the night fort, Jon. Pull there. He pressed his palm to the cold carved lips. The stone was cold enough to burn. He thought of nothing else. Not the time when he had pressed a hand to another cold stone in the crypts. Not the voices that had told him peace lay in obedience. He pressed harder. The cold sank through skin and into what lived beneath. He smelled the faint copper when blood slicked beneath his fingers and knew, without looking down, that his cut had opened. Eyes opened. In the stone, slow and soundless, lids lifted. The eyes were white and wet and patient. The mouth moved against his palm. Jon's breath stopped in his chest. "Who is there?" the stone asked, in a voice that was not a voice but a pressure in his bones. A movement of air pushed out of the oldest places. "Jon," he said, and then the name that had never left him, even when he tried to throw it away. "Snow." "Who passes?" asked the gate. A man bound to the wall. The old answers had to be honored, even if they were cages. "Then pass." The mouth breathed, and the stone softened. His hand sank through not stone but something that was cold, pliant, and alive, like the flesh of a winter fish. He did not pull away. Ghost leaned into his leg in a silent brace. Jon pushed. It swallowed his hand to the wrist. He expected pain, but what came was the tingle of cold water and a sensation like being sniffed by something that knew the smell of truth. It was an old feeling. It reminded him of Maester Aemon's blind gaze on his face, of Jeor Mormont's rough hand on his shoulder. "Pass," said the gate again, gentler, and then it opened. Not in a swing nor a yawn, but in a slow, receding draw, as if the stone were sliding out of the way of a story it had been sitting on too long. The pool drained. Behind the place where the mouth had been, a darkness shaped itself into a corridor. Jon lifted his torch and the flame leaned. Beyond the black gate the air was warmer and tasted faintly of salt and ash. He took a step. Ghost went first, darting forward with the caution of a wolf who knew caves. Jon followed, Longclaw unsheathed, torch high. The passage sloped downward. The stone of the wall faded into something older, a rock that glittered in places and swallowed light in others, like obsidian. The walls grew striations and pulsed with a warmth that was not from his torch. It felt like the breath of a fire that had died but left its ghost in the stones. Sam had said, "The first men did not fear the old powers at first. They came to the north with bronze and took wives under heart trees and learned the names of rivers. Before they built the wall, they learned how to make iron drink fire and how to keep that fire eeping inside the metal so it would wake only when called by cold. Koharik smiths remembered a part of it. They made the steel of the freehold sing, but the song was in a language they were only repeating. The older song lay deeper. Jon turned a corner and saw the room. He knew it was a room because the sensation of being inside changed. The echo of the tunnel faded and the torch climbed a high, soot-shrouded ceiling that opened in the center like a throat. Something had once vented heat here. The floor was smooth black stone. In the center was a basin like a font in a sept, but wider and long as a coffin, built of the same light-eating black. Beside the basin stood a frame of metal that might once have been bright, now a statue of ash, and a stand of tools that no rust touched. The tools did not gleam. They were gray and black and held a different kind of shine, the kind a crow's eye has when it watches your hand. There were carvings in the wall, not in the language of the Undulls or Valyria, but deep-cut marks like those Jon had seen once on an old stagbone comb in the crates author had taken from a buried hut, strong and spare, speaking more by the spaces between them than by the lines themselves. Jon took a step closer, lifted the torch and frowned. His mouth moved before his mind made sense of what he read. The words came raw and low, scraped from a place deeper than the throat, and as he spoke them something behind his sternum seemed to answer. The torch coughed. The soot on the ceiling stirred. "Ash of the holiest heart not cut by man," he said, reading what was not words so much as a pattern of memories. "Water drawn from ice older than kings. Fire that was never shamed. Blood willingly given by a son of winter. The iron must be fed on the breath of the living tree and speak to the cold before it drinks the heat. Temper not in oil nor in snow, but in the bridge between." There were more scratches, smaller, like singing notes beside a line of chant. The song for the folding. Give it 6 names of north and 6 names of fire. Fold no less than thrice and no more than the years of the moon that saw your birth. Ghost whined. Jon shut his eyes for a moment and listened. He could hear nothing but his own breath and, beneath it, a low, steady murmur like the sea under ice. He opened his eyes and looked at the tools. Hammers. Tongs with smooth inner faces. A rod pitted with 100 fine dimples, like a whetstone that had been given skin. In the basin, a ledge where a sword might lie, warm or cold as needed. He lowered the torch and ran his free hand along the rim of the basin. It was warmer than the air. His fingertips tingled. "Freely given," he repeated to the room. "Not taken. The first time he bled for this place, it had been to pass." That was a kind of petition. He had knelt then without meaning to. He did not kneel now. He stood and took a breath and touched his cut again, felt the stickiness of blood and said, "Not now, not yet." He left the way he'd come. The black gate closed behind him with a slow patience, and the carved mouth's lips sealed like a held breath released. The night fort creaked around him like an old sleeper rolling over. Outside, snow fell in powder that shivered in the torch's breath. Ghost was a smear of white against white until he turned and his red eyes found Jon's and were color in a world that was very nearly only black and white. At Castle Black, Jon found Dolorous Ed waiting atop the steps, looking like a man who had counted out the hours and found them wanting. Ed squinted at the torch and the frost in Jon's beard and said, "I don't reckon there's stew left that's not stuck to the bottom of the pot. If, by some miracle, something in this world ever stays where you want it." Jon smiled because he had to. "It was a door," he said. "Is that good?" Ed asked. "Doors keep cold out and let the wrong sort in, both at once." "Both might be true," Jon said. "Send for Tormund in the morning, and rouse the Ravenry. I need a letter flown to White Harbor and another to Old Town." Ed looked pained. "If the ravens don't eat each other, and if they don't eat me first, I always wondered what I'd look like as a pile of feathers and bones. I suppose I'll find out." Jon clapped him on the shoulder and went past. He slept, but not well. He dreamed of a sword lying in a bed that was also a river. He dreamed of a tree whose roots were a tangle of veins. He woke with his hand under his pillow where Longclaw lay, and a slick on his palm that was not sweat. The letters went out with the dawn, carried on wings that could not know the weight of what they bore. One to Wyman Manderly, Lord of White Harbor, a man whose bulk might hide a mind as sharp as any blade. One to Samwell Tarly, now at the Citadel, where the owls learned to say reason even to the moon. Another to the glass gardens at Winterfell, to the girl who had been Lyanna Mormont's hand in writs when Lyanna's own hand had been too quick for polite script. Sansa, he wrote that name last, and sat for a long time after writing it, staring at the grain of the table until the knots looked like wolves' eyes. He did not say, "I miss you." He did not say, "I am cold." He said need and he said truth, and he folded the parchment as if folding were a kind of prayer. When the answer came, it came first from Old Town, from Sam. The wax bore a lamp stamped clean. Jon broke the seal and breathed the scent of Sam's old, careful ink. "There is a part in a manuscript no one reads, a commentary on a commentary," Sam wrote, "that says iron remembers the way it was first melted. New iron cast in old molds behaves a little like the mold wants it to, even when you take it out. I wondered if steel could be made to remember how it felt to have a certain kind of heat, not just heat. Cohor's best keep the fire on the steel with words. That's what the Maester says, but I don't think words are all they used. They used blood sometime. I found a note. It says freely given too. It says king's blood, but in the next margin someone crossed out kings and wrote winters. I do not know what that means. Maybe the man who wrote it did not either. I know what you would say to blood, Jon. Believe me, I know. I think if there are other ways, the archives would not say them. They're full of ways men have bled other men. They are quieter about what the gods might accept besides blood. You would ask, what takes its place? There are hints of ash used in certain blessings. The ash of heart trees is never mentioned because no one would dare. But what if the ash is not from cutting a living tree? There are accounts of branches fallen in storms that men brought as offerings, then burned. Such ashes were sometimes used to wash a newborn. Jon read, and Ghost's head found his knee. He stroked the wolf's ear while the words worked deeper. The next letter was thick with Wyman Manderly's seal. Wyman wrote with more sauce and less caution. Winterfell's hot springs were spoken of from his table as if they were carved from a roast, there for the carving. If what you say can be done, Lord Commander, White Harbor will float half the world to your gate to bring what you need. I have ships fat and ships lean. I have men who know the way to Dragonstone by stars others haven't learned yet. If we must fetch you black glass, we will fetch the whole mountain. If we must fetch you wood that's dyed without a blade in it, we'll send men to the old bear's woods and tell them to look for branches the gods laid down on purpose. If you ask for blood, we'll ask whose, and if you ask for yours, I'll tell you to keep it where it is, because the North has lost enough. Jon snorted when he read that, a sound as brief as a cough. He folded the letter and set it aside, heavy with stains of gravy and something like wine that smelled of apples. Ghost licked his fingers clean in absent approval. Sansa's reply came last, neat and spare as a stitched hem. She had signed it with her own name and not an alias, and the sight of it made Jon feel something in his ribs he did not like to name. She wrote, "Our father used to say a sword is not the metal but the hand that holds it. I think a king is not a crown but the people who believe. If the North needs a new kind of sword to believe in, then make it. If the gods require something of a Stark to do it, remember that the Starks have always given things to the North before the North asked. I will send you Winterfell stores and the men who remain true. Lord Glover has returned to his seat. Lyanna Mormont will send what she can, which is fiercer than what most men will send. I am calling the banners under the wolf again. If we must ask the Vale to ride, we will arm their lances with whatever you can make. If it is to be my task to soothe injured pride, I will do it. But swear to me this, Jon. Do not take a life for this, not by force. We will not begin a new North with an old sin. He swore to the paper, though it could not hear him, and to Ghost, though the wolf already knew. Davos Seaworth arrived 3 days later with a boy in tow and a look like a man who had decided that he was going to be involved in a story whether he liked it or not. The boy was not a boy, not anymore. His arms were thick with a smith's muscles and his face was set for work. He had the look of King's Landing smoke about him still, even after weeks at sea and then weeks more at White Harbor. When Wyman wrote of floating half the world, he had not lied. "This is Gendry," Davos said. "He knows hammers." Gendry looked at the Night's Watch with a blacksmith's distrust of ideas that walk like men. He looked at Longclaw last and looked longest. "That's good steel," he said flatly. "You can hear it. Do you know Qohor songs?" Jon asked. "I know mine," Gendry said, with a shrug that made the leather pull at his shoulders. "I've worked for men who said they did. Mostly they knew how to charge. They stood in Micken's old forge at Winterfell, because the forges at Castle Black were too small, and the heart of this needed heat closer to home. Steam breathed through Winterfell's courtyards where the hot springs had been harnessed into channels. The air in the forge was wet and hot at once. Gendry set down the iron and the steel he had brought, and looked at the arrangements the watch had made. A deep trough lined in black glass Manderley's men had dragged in wagons from White Harbor. A hearth built deeper and broader than any in the north. A chimney cut wide enough to drink dragons if dragons came. "Freely given," Jon said aloud, "to the stones and the men." Davos nodded, thin-lipped. Tormund snorted and shook his head like a bear waking from sleep. Lyanna Mormont stood there too, fierce as her letter. She had ridden farther than her men liked to carry her small weight and had dismounted without help that she refused even with her eyes. "What do you need?" Gendry asked. "Wood," Jon said. "But not any wood. Ash of a heart tree not cut by man." He laid a thin branch on the table. It was white, very white, not with frost but with the kind of white that took light into it rather than bouncing it away. The branch was snapped at one end, not sawn. Its bark was peeled away as if by teeth, but not human. "This fell in a storm," he said. "From a tree that still stands. We took it with prayer. I brought it from the grove near the last hearth. The Umbers did not love it, but they understood." Gendry frowned, as a man does when confronted with something respectful. "Ash burns hotter than it seems it will," he said. "That wood will go to nothing. We'll be left with no more than a handful." Jon nodded. "A handful is what we need. The words speak of washing iron in what remains after the gods have tasted. I will not cut a living heart tree. I will not." "What else?" Davos asked. "If it's something that can be stolen from kings, I have expiry. If it's a thing that wants killing, we have Tormund." Tormund bared his teeth. "You lot talk and write like ravens building nests out of someone else's hair. Tell me where to set my feet, boy. Tell me who needs breaking." "We'll need water known by ice older than kings," Jon said. "The Black Gate Tunnel has a basin lined in obsidian. There's water beneath the wall that's been asleep a long time. We'll bring it here and keep it clean. And we'll need heat that's never been shamed. The songs in the margins call for dragonfire." He let those words sit like a new weight on the table. Silence had a taste in a forge. Today it tasted like iron about to be hammered. Davos broke it first. "Dragons don't answer letters," he said, practical to the bone. "They might answer duty," Jon said. "You mean to send for the Dragon Queen?" Lyanna said, not unkindly but sharp as snowfall on the skin. "You mean to ask her for fire to make your swords?" "Our swords!" Jon corrected gently. Lyanna accepted this with a small dip of her chin that held more steel in it than Gendry's racks. If she comes, will she expect us to bend the knee? She might, Jon said, but I have knelt enough for other men's pride. If I kneel again, it will be for the North's life. He left it there, for now. Sansa would handle the rest. Sansa was better with corners and knives that lived in tongues. The raven to Dragonstone flew heavy with the weight of what it carried. It carried more than a plea. It carried the suggestion of a way to bind two words that had been enemies since before men shaved their chins. Fire and ice. Bran spoke through a tree that night. Jon sat under Winterfell's heart tree and listened to leaves that did not move stir. He had found it hard, at first, to look at his brother's face when it peered like carving from the red-leafed white. Now it was easier. The face was Bran's but not. His mouth was that same soft mouth that used to always be asking for one more tumble from Hodder, one more slide down the palace, but his eyes were older than Winterfell. When Bran looked, the air behind him looked too. You found the room, Bran said. I did. And you read the song. I listened, Jon corrected. It was not words. Bran smiled, which was a leaf's motion felt rather than seen. The first men learned from the singers. The singers taught your kind not the words but the ways to hold them. We can't give everything. We tried once. Men broke what they were given, as men do, but they also made walls and swore oaths. The world is what it is because both things are true. Is there another way than blood? Jon asked. There is always another way than blood, Bran said. Sometimes it is harder. Sometimes it is not possible. Sometimes what the world asks is not blood spilled but blood promised. Freely given. You'll bleed, Jon. You always have. You would even if there were no gates, no songs, no swords to wake. That's the kind of man you are. That's not comfort, Jon said. It's truth, Bran said. Comfort is for after. In the morning the yards filled with men and women and iron. The Umbers sent old armor. The Glovers sent chain. The Mormonts sent axes and hands not afraid of heat. The Manderleys sent coal and coke, black as sharks, and men with bellies that shook when they laughed but not when they worked. The Watch sent discipline. The free folk sent stubbornness like a resource. Gendry took it all and measured it with his eyes and set men to work grinding, cutting, welding. He listened when Jon spoke of folding and songs, and he didn't laugh when Jon stumbled over the thick, simple syllables of an older tongue that had lived in the north before ravens learned to say Lord. They tried first with plain steel, and Jon said the words over it as it went red and yellow and white. Gendry watched for the moment the color turned a shade that was not any color you could catch in a jar. Now, he'd say, and lift the bar with tongs as gentle as a midwife's hands. He folded the steel and struck and folded again. He asked Jon to speak the 6 names of North. Jon chose names that had weight when spoken. Winterfell, Wolfswood, Long Lake, Skagos, Carhold, the Wall. He named fire too. Dragon, Sun, Wildfire, Forge, Hearth, Breath. He felt the words sink into the metal or into himself or both. Gendry nodded once in those moments. Once when the hammer fell true and the sound that came back from the anvil carried something that was not the ring of metal but a low reply like a throat singing. They quenched the first experiment in the black glass trough lined with obsidian and full of water clawed out from the black gate's veins. The hiss was not like any hiss Jon had ever heard. It was lighter, sharper, almost like laughter. And then the steam that rose off it did not gather on the ceiling as droplets so much as vanish into the air, as if it had been hungry for that very moment. The sword that came out was steel. It was a fine sword, better than many forged at Winterfell before, patterned faintly like rippled sand beneath a river. It caught the light and held it well, and its edge took a thumb hair with no tug. Jon set it on the table with a reverence he would not have used for anything else, and said, "Let's fetch a hand." Tormund's laugh broke several things, most of them pride. "A hand," he said. "And here I was thinking you only wanted trouble with kings." They fetched a thing that had been a man and now was only a problem. There were still a few whites in the deep cellars, double-chained and watched. They had not burned them yet because it was good to remember. Jon hated that it was useful. He did not go down with the men who fetched the white. He stood in the yard with the sword in his hands and ghost-pressed flank at his knee. The white came up snarling, and the men who carried it wore thick gloves and thicker courage. It rolled on the snow and scraped and made that hiss of an anchor dragged on gravel. The smell, it of earth and wrongness. Jon did not ask for trial by combat with a dead thing. He stepped forward and struck. The blade met bone covered in skin that should not have moved. There was a sound that was not bone breaking and not blade ringing. Something like a crunching of frost in a world a little too cold, and the hand came off. It writhed and scrabbled and stopped when Tormund crushed it beneath his heel. "And that's that," Tormund said. "No, that was not that." Gendry pulled the blade back and looked at it under the hard light of noon. A hairline, not on the edge but deeper in the body of the steel, where the folding had met and married. It was not a crack, not yet. It was a path that meant to become one. Gendry did not speak, but he set the sword down as if it were a sleeping child that had just coughed. "Not enough," Jon said. "Not yet," Gendry amended. They tried again and again. The second time, Jon said the names of the rivers. The third time, he said the names of wolves he had known. Grey Wind, Summer, Lady, Nymeria, Shaggy Dog, Ghost. The fourth time, he was silent and let the hammering be the only song. They worked until the light was long and then short and then not at all, and still the steel took a certain something and then denied it at the last. That night Melisandre stood silent at the forge's threshold. No one had invited her. No one had needed to. She walked as if heat liked her. The fire in the hearth bent toward her as if greeting an old friend. She looked at Jon the way she always had, like a word she had learned in a foreign tongue she had never quite learned to pronounce. And then at the black glass trough and the white stick of wood on the table. "You have come to the edge," she said. "Now step. We can do this without—" Davos began, but she shook her head very slightly and he fell quiet with a grimace, hand at his throat where the scar lay. "I am not your enemy, Onion Knight," she said. "I am not your friend. I am a lantern where you think you don't need one and no use at noon. We are not at noon." "What does the fire say?" Jon asked, because it was better to let her say it than to have her leave words unsaid like a snake under a bed. She looked into the forge and the glow that came back lit her face from inside like a lamp lit by a red flame. "Long ago a man broke his wife's heart with a sword and called the sword Lightbringer," she said softly. "But the light was not in the sword because he was cruel. The light was in the sword because he believed that blood unlocked what words could not. He was wrong and he was right. Blood opens. The question is, whose and how?" "I won't take it," Jon said. "I won't demand it." She nodded, the motion small. "The gate will accept yours if you give it. The gods here accept more than the Red God does. They are older. They like bargains better than tests. They like necessity. They like consent." Her mouth twitched. "They do not know kneeling very well." "Good for them," Tormund grunted. Melisandre's eyes had the sadness of someone who had left joy so long ago she could only use other people's words for it. "I have seen something," she said to Jon. "Not a sword in your hand that sets the world to rights. Many swords, 1,000 points of night, each with a little sleeping fire. When the cold comes close enough, the fire wakes. The cold wakes them." "Valyrian steel," Jon said. "A name is a name," Melisandre said. "It is a thing, but not the thing. The steel you want will wake when touched by what you made it for. Not all steel is meant for feasts." Jon looked down at his hand. He opened and closed it. He had bled in battle and bled when he tried to make peace and bled when he breathed too hard in the wrong air at the wrong time. To bleed in a room with a fire and men who loved him seemed almost small compared to other hurts. He looked to Gendry. "Will you make something worthy of this?" Gendry's mouth tightened. "I'll make it true," he said. "That's all we can do." They laid the new billets out. Gendry had chosen bars of the cleanest steel, an alloy he thought would take the folding well. He ground obsidian to powder finer than flour and mixed it with a pinch of salt on a white plate until it gleamed faintly like the inside of a seashell. He asked for the heart tree ash, and Davos brought it in a clay bowl and handled it as he would a child's keepsake. Jon set his palm over the little bowl and inhaled. "Freely given," he said. Then, without ceremony and without prayer except the one that lived in that phrase, he took a knife and cut his palm. The pain was sharp and clean. A drop swelled, round and red. It fell into the ash and turned it pink where it struck, and then black again as if the powder had drunk it. Jon let several drops fall, then closed his fist and raised his hand so the blood would stop in its own time and not waste what the world needed. Melisandre wrapped his palm with linen without touching him more than she needed to. Not kindness, exactness. The gods keep careful books. Gendry worked ash into the powder gently and fed the mixture into the seams of the first fold. He worked like a baker to whom bread is a matter of days and lives. He set the bar on the anvil and lifted his hammer. Jon spoke the words again, and this time the forge listened. The color in the steel went to a white that was more blue than yellow. Gendry folded it, and the puff of steam that rose when he quenched and raised again smelled faintly of pine and salt and something Jon could not place until Ghost sniffed and sneezed. It smelled like a heart tree after rain. "Now," Gendry said, eyes flat as iron plates. Jon named North and Fire. He named Winterfell last, not first, because he had learned that home is not where you begin but where you end. When the sword took its shape and lay in the trough to drink the old water, the hiss that rose was not laughter but a sigh from an old throat after a drink long denied. They say, "Ride the blade to the yard." The white they brought up fought with its mouth more than its hands. It wore the remnant of an old watch cloak. Jon had sent for this one because he knew it had come from one of theirs. There was a kind of apology in his posture as he stood waiting. Melisandre watched from the doorway with her head tilted like a hawk's. Jon raised the sword, then paused. "Gendry," he said, and the smith understood the question without it being asked. "Who should be the first to use something you created?" The answer was not always the man who had asked. "Your hand, not mine," Gendry said. "You said the words." Jon brought the blade down on the white's forearm, parted like rope. The hand went to the snow and writhed. The stump hissed as if snow had been thrown on a fire. The reek was cleaner than before, less foul, and the air itself seemed to sigh. The white snarled and reached. Jon took the head in a second blow. The blade passed through spine as if through reeds. For a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the thing was still, utterly still, not like a stopped thing but like one that had never moved. Snowflakes settled on its brow and did not melt. The sword's edge was untouched. No hairline stood in the body. Gendry took it after Jon lowered his arms and held it up to the light. It did not shine like Valyrian steel. It did not have that smoke within smoke. But when it moved, the air around it seemed to change its mind about being air. Jon held out his hand. The cut was already closed, the linen stained and drying. They had one. "Now we need 100, Tormund said, very cheerful. "Or 1,000. I was always a man with more friends than sense." Lyanna Mormont stepped into the yard, hair bristling beneath her cap like the needles of a small, very determined pine. 100 we can do, she said. 1,000 we will promise the gods and then learn how to cheat them without them minding. Wyman Manderly's ships came and went like slow whales, belly full of black glass and metals, fat with grain to keep the workers fed. Davos oversaw the docks and didn't permit unnecessary talk. He had found a peace and purpose, and he took his comfort in small things. A crate tied more securely than last time, a night without fog, a ledger with no ink blots. He sent men down the coast to Dragonstone with letters and then again with speech, until at last the sky spoke instead. When dragons come, the air knows before eyes do. Winterfell had not seen such shadows since before it had words. The first cry of the stable boys went up like geese. Men stumbled from the kitchens with ladles in their hands and hot breath fogging. Mothers seized children who wriggled to see and dragged them beneath lintels. Gendry stood in the yard with his mouth open and then closed it as if he were ashamed of the boy showing in him. Ghost lifted his head and did not growl. He looked with an old animal's calm at the dark that moved against the light clouds. Drogon was larger than memory. He came like a piece of night broken off and given purpose. Regal spun at his shoulder, green and bronze and smoke. and Valyrian followed whiter than snow turned to flame. They circled Winterfell once and twice, low enough that Jon could see the ripple of muscles beneath the scales and the way the cold curved the vapor of their breath. They came down not in the yard, which was too small, but in the godswood, and if there was a sacrilege in that, the heart tree did not show it. It stood with its face and watched. Daenerys Targaryen came on foot under Regal's wing, her hair pale as broken ice. She wore a cloak that made her look like frost, and none of it made her less warm. Her eyes found Jon's across the yard, not with recognition but with assent, as if some arithmetic had just been set down with both of their names summed under a line. "I got your letter," she said. Her voice made a puff in the cold. She had never belonged to winter and did not pretend to. "And then the second one, which asked not for me but for what I can bring." Jon bowed his head, not his knee. "We need Dragonfire," he said. "We need it because we have learned something I think you have a right to hear. The steel that kills the others must be woken. We have found a way to wake it with old song and clean water and ash. The fire is the peace we cannot make." Her gaze flicked to the forge, which had become more temple than workshop. "And if I give you fire, you will have given the North a way to survive," Jon said. "You'll have given the world a way to survive." He did not say anything about kneeling. Not yet. They were not at that part of the story. She looked past him to the men and women gathered. Manderly's sailors, Lyanna as fierce as any captain among them, Gendry with his hammer-scarred hands, Davos with his steadiness, Tormund with his rough good sense, Melisandre with her appropriated calm. She looked at Ghost and did not flinch. She looked at the heart tree and held its gaze as if it were a king. Then she nodded. "Show me the song," she said. They showed her. Jon bled into the ash again, a point of red, then another, then no more because the gods did not want spurting. He spoke the names in the language that did not have grammar but had gravity, and Daenerys stood with her hand on Drogon's muzzle, her eyes half-lidded, as if listening to two songs at once. When Gendry nodded, she stepped forward and said in a voice that had parleyed with cities, "Fire!" Drogon lowered his great head. His mouth opened. Heat hit them like a wall. It was not like forge heat. It did not have the order of an anvil's discipline. It was the heat of a world remade. Gendry stepped toward it with the billet in his tongs and the white of his eyes not showing. He fed the metal to the dragon's breath, and the metal went to a color that Jon had no name for, something that felt like the inside of a star. He spoke the 6 names and the 6 names again, and Melisandre more, mewed in her own tongue, soft and fast, and the heart tree's face listened, sad as ever. Not 1,000, not even 100, but enough. Swords, yes, and spearheads and axe blades for the bear women and for the men of the mountain clans. A few dirks for knives meant to go under a rib into a place where even the dead remembered what dying was supposed to do. Each had a little sleep in it. Jon could feel it when he held one. He would have said magic if he had been another man with another mouth. Being Jon, he said nothing and put the blade in the rack with the others and went to wash. They called it winterforging at first, because Northerners do not like to speak the names of their enemies, even when the name would lend them glory, and because this steel had more winter in it than summer, more night than day. Even the Manderly men, who liked fancy names and fish fit for a duke, took to the plain phrase. The songs that followed would give it other names. Nightfire, King's Bloodless, Ghost Steel. But in the yard the words were always simple. They armed the North as best they could. Mormont women took axes that sang like birds muffled beneath snow as they swung. Karstark men favored long-bladed spears. Glover men wanted stout short swords that could be used in close. Manderly had pikes sent up river by barge. Their points glimmered with a quiet a man noticed only when he noticed he had survived. The mountain clans came to sit by the forge and watch, as men do by a hearth they do not know the story of. They left with blades and kept their comments for the gods. Sansa came. When she entered the yard, several men forgot what their hands were for. She wore her hair braided like a promise and a gown with fur at throat and wrist that made her look taller. But she had not grown in inches, only in weight. She watched a sword quenched and a white dispatched and did not flinch. When Jon went to her, she hugged him hard enough that Longclaw's pummel pressed into his ribs. and only afterwards stepped back with a posture that reminded him of their mother, who had never been his mother and always had. "I have letters," she said, "from the Vale, from the Riverlands. Wyman has sent you his bill. He's made it very poetic." Her eyes went past him to Daenerys and narrowed in that precise way Sansa had, where her opinions were wrapped in silk and then pinned with steel. "And the Queen. She brought fire," Jon said. "She will want more than thanks," Sansa said evenly. "I will see she gets courtesy." "Thank you. Do not thank me for doing what must be done." She touched his bandaged hand lightly and her eyes softened. "Does it hurt?" "Less each time," Jon said, and saw her notice what that meant. He saw her mouth tighten the smallest bit. She filed the information away where she kept the things she did not like but might need. Arya came like a wind that had lost its way among 7 roads and then found it again at once. One day there was no Arya, the next day there she was in the yard wearing a face that looked like a girl from the Dreadfort and a walk that was not. Jon knew her before she spoke, before she smiled, because Ghost trotted to her with absolute confidence and licked her hand like a pup. She laughed and pushed his head away and then let him lick again. Her face was hers when she turned to Jon. He hugged her and felt the knives on her belt as clearly as he felt her bones. "Everyone has blades now," she said after she had watched Gendry at work for an hour with half her mind elsewhere. "Even the dead." "Not like these," Jon said. "No," she agreed. "Not like these. These are sleeping until they're not." She tilted her head. "Is that how you are?" Jon laughed, which made Gendry look up, which made Arya look away from Jon to Gendry as if she had not meant to, and that made Jon look at Sansa with a question. Sansa's mouth did the smallest thing. Jon found himself smiling at that, and then he remembered where they stood. He sobered. Bran did not come in a way men could see. He was there whenever the heart tree's leaves spoke without moving, and sometimes in the unquiet rustle of the thatch where no wind went. Jon felt him more than he heard him. Across nights, across days, in the moments when time went thin like the ice on the first day of a hard freeze, he felt Bran watching. The others did not wait politely while the North armed. They came where the wall was weakest, Eastwatch by the sea, where the salt ate the stones and the wind chewed them, and they tested the discipline of men and ice. Ravens came black and breathless. Jon read the scratches on the parchment and did not yell. He put down the letter and took up Longclaw and then put Longclaw down and took up one of the Winterforged swords instead. "Leave that," Tormund said. "Take them both." Jon nodded and took them both. He did not ride at the head of the column like a hero in a story. He rode where he could see men's backs and faces both. Davos rode on his right. Lyanna rode on a pony that had kicked a smith and broken one of the newer swords in a way that satisfied Gendry because no magic was involved, only mule-headedness. Sansa stood on Winterfell's wall and did not wave. Daenerys took the sky. It was not a battle in the old way. The first time Jon saw another on the ice it was at a distance, an angle of blue that was not the sky and not the sword either, a man shape with a crown of ice like hair fallen and frozen around a helmet that was not made. When Drogon's shadow crossed that blue it did not look up as men do. It simply altered. The air around it grew colder and then colder still. On the sea ice beyond the washed stones of Eastwatch, men's breath made small clouds that slowed, hung, and fell like snow. "Steel," Jon said, and raised the Winterforged sword. Around him Manderly men lowered pike points. Free folk bared axe heads that did not shine. The first rank of the others came forward walking like swans. Jon met one. Longclaw had always sung against iron and bone. Against the others blade it breathed, and the breath made frost. The Winterforged sword did not breathe. It woke. Jon felt the heat stored in the steel leap at the cold as a dog leaps at a thrown stick. The other's blade slid up to meet his. The sound was not ring. It was a thin keen like a hair pulled tight. When his edge bit, the other cracked along the line of the cut like pond ice under a boot. It fell in shards that hissed and went to steam. The waking was not much. It did not blaze in his hands. It did not glow. He felt it because he had given it his blood. Another man would feel only a slight change in the choke of the handle and a faint heat that would bloom in the palms like life returning after cold. But it would be enough. He turned and cut again, and around him the others broke and fell. They did not retreat. Retreat was not a thing the cold did. But they thinned. The men behind Jon stepped into the spaces in the line as if they had practiced the dance for years. Drogon sent a flower of fire across the ice where the whites crept. Rhaegal swooped low and made a path of clear for charging men. Valyrian flew a rope of flame across a curve of icy spear points and turned them to water and then steam that froze and fell as hail. The sound of the ice cracking was like laughter again, only this time it laughed on the side of the living. Later, in the steamy dark under the Eastwatch walls, men lay on blankets drinking broth and staring at their hands because their hands were still warm. Jon sat on an overturned crate with Ghost's weight against his boots and felt the ache in his shoulders that said he had fought enough for one day. Daenerys came in smelling of dragon and clean sweat. She sat across from him and did not make a show of her rank. After a time she said, "Your steel wakes when it meets them." "Melisandre said so," Jon replied. "I believed her for once." "She says many things," Daenerys said dryly. "This one was true. I saw it." She folded her hands. "I will ask you soon for what I need," she said. "But not today. Today we count the living." He looked at her and nodded. "We do." They did. They found to their surprise that they had more than they thought, which is a rare thing. Men who would have gone down with blue in their lungs did not. A boy from White Harbor who had seen too little of the world to fear it yet laughed when he should have cried because his pike had broken another and he had not. Lyanna scolded a Manderly who had lost his helmet. Davos washed his hands and then washed them again as if cleanliness were a prayer. The news from the south came as news does, delayed and unhelpful. Littlefinger played his games with the Vale and lost because Sansa had learned to play games with more than knives. The Riverlands bled more quietly. The Lannisters sent no help and got little joy. Winter closed roads that had not known closure in fields where brassicas once pushed up their stubborn heads. The world forgot that there had been summers where men died of heat. In the forge, Jon bled less, and the blades came faster. Gendry taught others to fold and quenched with a briskness that did not erase the reverence in his hands. The Winterforged steel did not clone itself. Each piece took some making. But the work grew familiar. Like any good ritual, it wore a groove you could walk in without looking down. Melisandre left one morning when the frost made the yard look like stolen starlight. Jon did not try to stop her. She had never belonged here, not truly. She had lent her eyes and her heat to a task that needed both, and then she went where her god called her, if it had. Davos watched her go without speaking. Sansa watched her go and then exhaled in a way that made the air seem warmer at once. Bran told Jon secrets he would have liked to keep, but could not. He said them calmly, like weather. He said, "I was there when our aunt died." He said, "You are not bastard in the way you thought, but I cannot say the words people will need said." Jon listened and then put the words aside because no sword had ever been made of them. Sansa listened too, and her face did a thing that was almost grief and almost relief, and then she put the words aside with the same precision because the living had to come first. Arya did not put the words anywhere that could be seen. The second battle was at last Hearth, where the Umber's hall squatted like a stubborn bull on its mound. The others did not break themselves on its walls because they did not care for walls. They went around, over, through. Jon had seen that kind of mind on men in battle who wanted to live and didn't care to be clever. This was like that, only not. He placed Mormont axes at the postern gates and Glover spears at the westward approach and Manderly pikes in the yard itself where the ground could be slippery. He placed himself where the line would be hardest and instructed that if he fell, no one do anything foolish. Tormund laughed. "And what will that leave us to do?" "Less than you want," Jon said. He smiled. "More than you like." Rhaegal came down low over the field to blast a swath of whites to steam. A crack appeared in the wall where the cold had seeped into the mortar and encouraged it to forget its job. Cold is good at making things forget. Men shouted. The line dipped. Jon felt the Winterforged blade wake and punched forward. He did not think. He had learned long ago the shape of a fight. The breath before, the stupid half-second in the middle when you fear something for no reason and the blade falters just enough to get you killed, the careful last push. He lived in the breath and the last push. The middle took care of itself because he would not let it be otherwise. The others did not roar or cry. They went down like fragile statues and then were not there. The whites came in snarls and were cut and burned and then ash. A woman from the mountain sea. Lands loosed a winter-forged arrow and it flew with an odd hum. When it struck another, it did not embed. Cracked the thing in two and went on. Later she would say she hadn't drawn any harder. The bow simply knew what it wanted. When the sun, such as it was, moved behind the gray that had been sky and became not sky, the battle thinned. Men still stood on the wall at last Hearth. The hall that had always been a place for meat and song had smoke sweating from its eaves. Jon leaned on a post and breathed. His sword hung quiet in his hand. Daenerys landed regal in the yard because Drogon had gone with Valyrian to chase something shiny and terrible over the trees. Ice that moved like birds. "Two," she said without greeting. "Two of them together. We cannot be everywhere," Jon said. "No," she agreed. She looked at him. "But we can be here." He slept that night in a bed that had seen giants of umber size snore in contentment and left grooves in the straw. He slept badly because he slept at all. He dreamed of the forge room under the wall and of a river that ran both ways. He woke with the sensation of hands on his face, gentle mother's hands, and then opened his eyes to Arya sitting cross-legged on the floor like a cat and flicking a blade through her fingers absently. "Still alive," she said. "You too. Try to sound more surprised." He smiled into his palms. "I will work at it." When the veil arrived under banners that still had too much blue for Sansa's taste, he said the words he had to say and accepted their oaths for what they were. Levers. He showed them the steel, and Lynn Corbray, who smiled too wide when he flattered you, caressed Lady Forlorn and then took up a winter-forged spearhead and made a very pretty throw that pinned a white to a beam. He looked at the spearhead with interest he could not fake. "Even Lady Forlorn might like friends," he said, and laughed like a knife cutting silk. "Don't give him two," Sansa murmured. She had come to like practicality more than drama. "I won't," Jon said. The arming of the North was not a moment but a season. You could have stood in the yard and seen the same work done every day until you forgot it mattered. That was the danger. Jon was careful not to let it become background. He bled his drops, no more than necessary, and felt a little faintness each time that he accepted as payment rather than punishment. He ate more. He slept when he could. He learned to laugh just enough that men would not think him a statue, and not so much that they would think him their brother more than their lord. Men began to name the swords, not the grand names of songs. Names like Hearthfrost and Wolf's Breath and Netmender for the pike that saved a fisherman's son. Those names told truths no minstrel would put to lute and were better for it. Gendry kept a chalk slate in the forge where he wrote the names as men spoke them. When the slate was full, he wiped it clean with the heel of his hand and began again. Memory lives in little things more than large. The North remembered. The others sought to break that remembering. They came in force one night under a moon that looked like a coin no one had spent. They came not with ranks but with a subtlety that denies men their courage. They came as cold that gnaws rather than strikes, as fear that stoops and nips rather than swoops. The wall moaned. Ghost lifted his head once and then settled back, unconcerned. Jon striped on his furs and went out to the yard with the sense of being watched by something too patient to ever blink. He did not think the others had a king, not in the way men did, with oaths and rings and promises. But there was a will among them that drew them together like iron filings around a lodestone. That will pressed against the walls of Winterfell that night like a deep water current pushing at a ship's hull. The heart tree's leaves stirred without wind. Bran's presence strengthened until it seemed the gods would had grown around the keep and not the other way around. From the dark came a sound like a horn. Men froze. Jon's muscles remembered before his mind did. The horn on the fist of the first men sounded thrice. The old tales of the horn of Joramun that would wake giants and break the wall. This horn was neither. It was a call to despair. It spoke to the part of wool that wants to rot and the part of wood that wants to mold. It spoke to surrender. Some men dropped their weapons. "Eyes!" Jon shouted. because he had learned that the way to break despair is to give men something small to do that reminds them they are still themselves. Look at your own hands. He held his up. He flexed it. Count your fingers. Say a name that belongs only to you. He said, Jon, and then Snow. And then under his breath the name no one had to hear, the one Bran had offered and that he had not yet decided whether to carry. He said it without letting it take him. He let it run through him like heat and out again like breath. Men all along the wall named themselves and counted fingers. The horn blew again and found fewer open places to go in. He took the Winterforged sword and went to the gate. Daenerys stood beside him with a look that said more than any vow. They opened the inner gate and let the first ranks of wights break themselves on pikes and axes while the dragons sent flowers of flame over the mass. An other walked up the mound of burned bodies with the serenity of a learned man climbing a staircase. Jon met it at the top of the heap of ash and bone. Their blades kissed. The Winterforged steel woke and sang. Not with a sound but with a sensation. He cut. It broke. The horn ceased. Silence fell heavy then, of the relieved kind one hears in a babe's first round of sleeping. They closed the gate. Day came after. When day comes after a night like that, men tend to overpromise. Jon kept his mouth shut. He walked the walls and spoke to men by name and learned where the tremble was worst. Han. DS or voice or eyes, and then put a job into those places so they would become steadier. Daenerys ate with the Manderly sailors and listened to an old man tell a joke that required fish and an archon of Tyrosh. Sansa met with Glover and Corbray and did not let either feel superior. Arya came and went like usefulness. The dragons slept heavy. Later, in the Godswood, Bran spoke again. You have made a bridge, he said. Between what and what? Jon asked as if he did not know. Between the ways of men and the ways of what came before, Bran said. Between ice and fire. Between what is taken and what is given. The world likes bridges more than walls. Jon looked up at the carved face and thought of all the Starks who had died because they believed in simple things like justice. He thought of all the men who would live because he had bled into ash. He thought of a name he had been given by a boy he loved who was almost not a boy anymore. He did not say any of it. Ghost leaned on his leg. It was enough. They did not win a single war after that. They won many small ones. They held Eastwatch and Last Hearth and the Carhold, which knew how to be cold and did it better than anyone. They lost Torrance Square and took it back. They lost Deepwood Motte and took it back. They learned the pattern of the enemy's patience and the places where it didn't bother to press. They learned how not to waste dragons on what men could do and how not to waste men on what dragons could do. In the south, stories began to creep north of a queen who would not let go of her seat even if it cost her the world, and a queen who rode dragons and did not enjoy using them except when she did, and a bastard who was perhaps not, and a red woman who had left a trail of failed prophecies behind her like crumbs someone else would eat. The North let those stories run like children in the yard and then called them in when it grew dark. They winterforged steel and fed it to hands that had learned not to expect miracles. The miracle was that they lived when they should have died. Men do not make songs about that because it lacks symmetry. They make families about it instead. Gendry married in the forge itself, because the woman he loved smelled of ash and sweat and found that better than perfumes. Arya did not marry. She came and went with a light step and a heavier knife and sometimes sat on the forge threshold and watched Gendry shape heat with a look that was neither regret nor envy, just witnessing. Sansa did not marry either, not then. She had become too useful. She wore a simple ring cut from a piece of winterforged steel with no jewel in it, and somehow it looked richer on her finger than rubies had on another girl's. Wyman Manderly's son smiled and offered fish and did not press. Daenerys stood with Jon at the head of a hall where stew steamed and bread was cut and men's laughter rose to the rafters with a roaring cheap and good and said, "This feels like a kingdom." "It feels like dinner," Jon said. "Maybe those are the same. Maybe." She still had not asked him to kneel. He still had not offered. It was possible to defer a question until after the world ended and begin anew on the other side. That is not strategy. It's hope. They did not call it either. The last time Jon bled into the ash, his hand trembled just a little. He didn't try to hide it. Gendry watched and waited for the drop and nodded when it fell. "Enough," he said. Jon suspected it was enough because Gendry had decided it was out of mercy. Then he picked up a billet and hammered with such intensity that mercy seemed an unlikely word. Mercy and hardness are less opposite than people pretend. Bran's last message did not come in the rustling of leaves or the murmur of roots. It came in Sam's hand, in careful script with ink blots here and there because Sam, for all his care, was still Sam. The Citadel had chosen not to choose. It would neither interfere nor help. That meant it had already chosen to disbelieve and let others carry the consequence. Sam had decided to believe. He had found a clue in a book no one had read because its binding was dull, and that clue said the place where the cold moved like a will was not a place at all but a moving wound. The wound was at the Bay of Seals. It would come west until it met something it could not eat. That would be the Wall, or it would be Winterfell, or it would be a line of men with waking swords. "Then we meet it," Jon said. They did. On a plain of ice whose cracks looked like writing done by very tired gods. They stood. They set their pikes and held their axes ready and let the dragons pass overhead again and again until the air hummed with heat and cold. The wound came. It did not announce itself. They knew it by what it did to birds. A flock of crows rose from a patch of woodland on the plain's far edge and flew, then stopped unchanged mid-flight and fell suddenly, as if the air around them had forgotten how to hold. The wound moved like that. It was emptiness with a will. When it reached their line, the winter-forged blades woke not gently but all at once. Men cried out against the heat even as they welcomed it. Jon felt it as a seep into his bones, as a reminder to the body of how to be alive. He stepped forward and the wound rejected him. Could not eat what had been told it could not. The others that came with the wound, riding its edges like fish ride a wave, broke and scattered and did not reassemble. Drogon roared, and the roar had language in it even men could hear, mine. Rhaegal's breath ran along the wound and hardened it wherever it touched until it was only a gorge in a river that men could bridge. Valyrian dove exhaled, rose again with a hiss like a song. Set your feet, raise your blade, speak your name, count your fingers, say the names of the places you love. It was that simple and that hard. They did it. The wound slowed. It stopped. It found edges it could not gnaw and beg. And to pull back not with malice or fear but like a wave that will always go back because that is what waves do. It retreated until the ice shone wet where it had passed, and then that wet refroze under a sky that had remembered it could be a sky. After no one sang, they ate salted beef and onions and sat with their hands splayed to watch the blood in their fingers return to its color. Jon stood with Longclaw on his back and the winter-forged blade at his hip and watched, too. Ghost yawned an enormous, unconcerned yawn and then lay down with his head on Jon's boot. "You did it," Daenerys said, coming to stand beside him in armor that looked like it would like to be a dress and had decided against it. "We did it," Jon corrected. He looked up at the sky where the dragons circled to cool their bellies. Their bellies steamed. "And we did not do all of it. The North did some. The old gods did some. Your gods did some. The fire in a forge did a little because it was treated like a thing you bargain with, not own. The ice did a little because it likes balance more than men do." "You sound like a priest," Daenerys observed. "I sound like a man who is tired," Jon said. She smiled, slow, not unkind. "I prefer that," she said. "It's harder to argue with." Later, when the first green showed where it should not have, the tender, foolish green of shoots trying too early in cold ground, they accepted it. They did not tear it up, suspicious. They did not cheer as if the world had been saved because a sprout had decided to trust it. They put a little fence of sticks around it so no foot would crush it and went on about their work. That is how the North is brave. In Winterfell's yard, the forge cooled and heated and cooled again. Gendry kept working because he did not know how not to. He made winterforged sickles for women to reap in ground that would need reaping again. He made knives shaped for peeling potatoes and knives for paring apples and laughed at himself because he had not meant to make a life here and now he had. Arya watched him then too sometimes and then looked away and left and then came back. Sansa walked the walls with a face that had lines now, good lines, and talked to men who had to be told that peace was not a permission to be fools. Wyman Manderley sent fish and a book of poems about fish that made Davos snort broth out his nose. Lyanna Mormont drilled boys who would be men and men who had forgotten how, and when she shouted they ran faster than any queen could make them. Melisandre did not come back. Perhaps she was dead. Perhaps she was molten in a god's mind. Perhaps she had laid down the weight of being wrong and right at once and gone to sleep at last. The Red God kept his own books, and no one had learned to read them. Bran said, "This is not a story that ends but a story that narrows until it becomes what men call living." He said it from everywhere and nowhere, and then he was quiet for a time long enough that Jon could pretend he wasn't listening. Jon stood at the Black Gate one last time before spring. He put his hand on the stone mouth and felt only stone. He did not bleed. He did not ask to be let through. He stood and listened to see if there was anything left to say. The gate said nothing. The silence was not hostile. It was waiting. He had come to understand that silence is often not the opposite of speech but its other half. He nodded, and Ghost flicked an ear at something only he could hear, and they walked back up into the light where the day had the color of something beginning. On the way he thought of the first time he had held a winter-forged blade, felt it wake, felt the small heat move through his palms like an old friend climbing back into his bones. He thought of his blood and ash, of swords named by men who had no time for songs, of a heart tree that had watched enough to let itself be surprised. He thought of Daenerys's look when the wound stopped moving and of Sansa's firmness that held peace like a bowl you do not spill. He thought of Arya's step, soft and sharp, and of Davos's careful hands. He thought of Sam, far away, feeding words to the world like chickens, hoping one would survive. Back in the yard, Gendry held up a sickle to the light and grinned at nothing in particular. "This one will cut," he said to no one, and then to Jon without asking, "Do you think they'd let me keep the forge after?" "After what?" Jon asked. "After the world stops needing steel that wakes," Gendry said. "After it only needs steel that chops cabbage." Jon looked at the forge and the walls and the sky beyond, which had learned how to be blue again when it chose. He looked at Ghost, who looked back with wolf wisdom that is both very deep and very simple. He said, "I think we'll always need both." He hung Longclaw in its place and took instead one of the unnamed Winterforged swords, not because he loved it more but because it felt like the moment. He walked to the heart tree with it in his hand and stood a respectful distance. "We made what we needed," he said softly to the carved eyes. "You gave us a way to do it without taking what we shouldn't." The carved mouth, as always, did not move. The eyes did not blink. But a leaf fell very softly. Ghost watched it land, then let it be. Jon smiled into his shoulders. When men asked later, as they always do, how did the North survive? The answers varied. Some said dragons. Some said a king who would not call himself one and a queen who let him. Some said steel that woke. Some said women with axes. Some said a gate that wanted consent. Some said a forge where a man bled into ash because he believed in bargains. Some said the gods. Some said the people who learned to count their fingers when despair blew its horn. All of it was true. Truth in the North had always been a beast with many heads. They gave it a yard to live in and a sky to look up to. They named their swords simple names and did not sing much beck. Oz their throats were needed for eating and laughing and calling children in at dusk. They remembered. They remembered the cold and how it moved and how it could be stopped. And they remembered the feeling of a blade waking gentle in their hands like a small warmth that came back because it had to. Jon let the winter-forged sword rest across his knees as he sat on the low stone by the godswood pool that steamed in winter and sighed in summer. He closed his eyes and listened. The water whispered. The leaves, which would one day be green again, held still and then murmured. He did not ask for messages. He did not need them. He had built a bridge. He knew how to walk it now. He knew others would walk behind him and not need him to point the way all the time, which is the truest sign that a thing has been done well. Ghost lifted his head and sniffed the air and then lay it down again. He slept. Jon did not. He watched the day stretch and thought, this is what the books always forget to write about. He felt the blood move slow in his hands, and somewhere, under the skin of the world where words did not often go, he felt the little sleeping fires he had helped put into steel turn over and purr. It was enough. It was not all. It never would be. But it was enough for now. The next time he took the field, the winter had softened, only just, and the men knew their work as if it had been their fathers and grandfathers before them. He rode not at the head but where he could see faces, and the dragons through shadows that felt less like omens and more like companions. The others did not come that day. He found himself smiling at nothing. He looked down at his hand, at the faint white line where the cuts had closed and closed again, and he thought, freely given, freely returned. He flexed his fingers and counted them, habit now more than instruction, and spoke his name without noise. Then he turned his horse's head toward where he was needed next, which was nowhere dramatic, only somewhere plain. A village where pikes had to be set correctly, a storehouse that wanted securing, a child who needed to be taught why you don't touch a blade even if it looks asleep. He went. That is what kings do, whether they call themselves that or not. That is what men do when they have built a bridge and need to keep it swept. In Winterfell's night, the forges still glowed. In the Godswood, the heart tree looked with blind red eyes at a world that had decided, for a while, to go on. In the sky, a dragon turned as easily as a thought coming round. In the yard, a sword was lifted by a hand that had earned it, and the steel, quiet as ever, waited for the cold to come close enough to wake it. It was content to sleep until then. The North was content to let it. And in the end, when the last horn blew and it was not a horn of despair but of supper, men laughed like men, and the sound was a warmth all its own. The winter-forged steel lay on racks and on hips and above mantles. Longclaw hung where Jon kept it, a reminder and a companion. The gates were shut and the cookpots were full, and a tired wolf slept with his head on a man's boot. Outside the walls the wind spoke, but not in lies. It spoke of what it had learned, that bridges could be stronger than it guessed, and that some fires will sleep forever until the cold reaches them, and then wake and do what they were asked and rest again. That, too, is a kind of magic, and it was the North's.